started in just a minute? All right. Welcome back, everybody. And to those of you on the live stream, thank you so much for joining us all day. I've noticed we've had a pretty stable contingent of people watching, or at least having their computers open and the stream running. So maybe a window there and the Orioles game on another screen or something. Just before the break, or during the break, Christoph asked if we could provide a little bit of background about what the group has done before we get into a discussion about what the group should do. And if we should kind of go over that. And before I hand it over to Bonnie, I figure we'll give you a little opportunity, a little background about where the group stands, because I didn't cover that this morning. I think it's fair to say that the group has not gotten very far. We had a meeting in Tokyo, and during that that was the first meeting of the group, even though the group has not yet been formally approved. We're having our second unofficial meeting as a group here. The meeting in Tokyo was, I'd say that there's maybe about 35, 40 people there. We spent a good chunk of the time talking about maybe one of RDA working group or interest group's favorite activities, which is, are we a working group or are we an interest group? Because we had put in for a working group, in large part because we wanted to have a limited time frame with which to work with. Because a working group exists for about 18 months, is limited to 18 months, and then ceases to exist, and you have a narrow scope. And one of the things that Nettie, Bonnie, and I, and a few others who had been talking about this is the question of privacy and research data is huge, as evidenced by our conversation today. And if we don't put any kind of constraints on it, we could be here 10 years from now still talking about frameworks for research data and privacy. But we decided to head as a group, we decided that it made more sense to pursue this as an interest group, which can have practical outcomes, but can also do things that working groups cannot. So we can, as an interest group, have joint meetings with the health data group and the ethics group, and we can form collaborative working groups to address problems, say, in the ethics and privacy issues. So there were opportunities available as an interest group that are not available as a working group. So that, and realistically, while we, as chairs or co-chairs of the group, have a desire for a limited scope, we're also realistic that we probably cannot achieve all of the things that we want to achieve, even if we do create some practical outputs in 18 months. The conversations about privacy are things that are going to be ongoing. This is something that came out of NISO's work in the framework for patron privacy, is that privacy is not a do it once, put it on the shelf, you've done that, check that box. It is something that constantly evolves. You constantly have to update your approaches as the legal infrastructure changes, as the security threats change, as people's perceptions of the issues change. So that lend itself towards a ongoing RDA group, which is constantly updating and maintaining whatever frameworks or bibliographies or et cetera outputs that we want to produce. So Bonnie, Mehdi, have all committed to 18-ish month initial term, and hoping that the community, once we've got things moving and kind of moving along, will continue to support it and continue to engage. Beyond that lovely conversation about process, we've decided to organize some task groups. One task group on a sort of framework issues task group. There's another on definitions. Look at that. These are the task groups. So that was one of the things that we had settled on. We're organizing those groups. We've a couple people during the call 2 weeks ago volunteered to step up and serve as sort of conveners of these task groups here at RDA. And then during the meeting we'll have on Friday, we'll have breakout groups of these with hopefully at least as many people as are here, and maybe many more, who can break out and spend 10 or 15 minutes and sort of develop some ideas about what each of these things will be, and develop a kind of action plan for those various topics. And let's see, we started work on a bibliography again. I noted that. It needs a lot more effort. I think if we just take some of the references from the slides, that'll probably double the number of items in the bibliography.
So, could you just explain what we've heard about the bibliography a few times? So, what exactly are you wanting to do with that? So this is a bibliography.
What we'd like to do is create a community. Sorry for the recording. For the recording, what is it that we want to do with a bibliography? What is it going to be, and why is it going to exist? We want to create a resource that will have people can go to for information on and background and far more rich detail about some of these issues. So privacy and anonymization, there's probably 75 or 100 articles that are out there in the world that we could put in the bibliography and organize it in such a way that if people want a deep dive into that information, they have a resource to go to.
Okay. So it's full scope of the
Yeah. So a community resource for information on research data and privacy that is categorized by technical aspects, legal aspects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So does anybody have any questions about how we've got to where we are? And as I mentioned, the last thing, the Technical Advisory Board, the tab of RDA, basically said, your case statement looks great. The fact that we've got 50 or so people who've signed up to participate in the working group is a great sign of interest. It's actually a decent sized group for RDA. By comparison, some of the others are smaller. So that's a great sign. The problem was we skipped over the fact that we need to have some international representation in the chair roles. They would also like to see broader international participation in the interest group as a whole. It's I'd say about 2/3 to 3/4 of the members right now are US based. And the RDA obviously is an international organization, wants to see more of that. I think a lot of people are waiting on formal approval and waiting to see some of these things about what we're actually going to do before they sign up. And I'm hoping that during the meeting this time, we can bring in some more people to participate. So with that as a background, does anybody have any questions about where we stand as an interest group? Great. So I'm going to pass it over to Bonnie who's one of the co-chairs and a fellow at the Data and Society Institute, to lead us through this conversation. Nettie and I will be running around with the mics because we do want to record this. We've moved the camera up so we're not getting just the backs of people's faces during this conversation. So again, if you want to say something, contribute something, which we absolutely want you to do, just raise your hand. I'll be on one side and Nettie will be on the other. I'll stay over here.
All right, so, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. No? Your mic? Yeah. See, is that better? Says it's on. Is that better? Okay, I'll just hold it right here. Okay, all right. So first of all, I wanted to thank our presenters. I know they're not all here at this point, but today was just such an interesting day for me. I also want to thank you all for joining us here. I know it's a Sunday, so I appreciate you guys being here to kind of have this conversation with us. I mean, as Christine said, I think what's very clear is that everyone is sort of talking about the instability of even the definition of some of these things we're talking about. What is research? Who are researchers? What is the definition of even data and data research and privacy? And so obviously it's a very kind of constantly changing topic that we're working on. So like Todd said, we have these ideas for task groups. These kind of came out of the bigger group we have. They're not necessarily the only ones we have, and some may end up becoming kind of subsumed under others. But I put this up there so that you all get the sense of kind of what we're thinking in terms of how we want to attempt to look at some of the issues around privacy implications of research data. So I want to make sure you all have plenty of time to talk, so I'm just going to kind of do like a quick overview of some of the topics. So we talked about, we talked from the perspective of sort of the research subjects, thinking about sort of, privacy is giving people enough information to make the decision they want to be able to make about their privacy, thinking about the subjects in terms of individuals or in terms of communities, and thinking about how we sort of design interfaces for making sure that research subjects sort of understand without having to read all the text. We talked about sort of the perspective of from that of researchers, from that as sort of governance, thinking about sort of reuse of data and sort of the role of how do we, who's sort of protecting the data in the long term, who's sort of thinking about privacy and sort of implications more than just sort of that initial research and project that's been done. We're thinking about sort of the role of repositories in that role of housing data and the longer term implications. We've sort of talked about the technical work of anonymity and obscuring data, yet still being able to get work done. I think it's great to hear, I think medicine and sort of bioscience is a lot further along for a lot of sort of legal and ethical issues, but there's a lot of disciplines that are just starting to kind of navigate some of these issues. So I really appreciate hearing from medicine to kind of see a discipline disciplines that are much sort of further along in those conversations. In fact, one of our task groups is sort of disciplinary differences, and one of the roles I play at Data and Society, where I work on a few projects and research sort of research grants, is looking at how the discipline of computer science and sort of data science, how they're navigating ethical issues, especially new ethical implications of the work that they do, and it's really interesting to see a discipline sort of earlier in the stages of trying to work through some of these issues, and then to see medicine that's so much further along. So, so at this point, what we're looking for and sort of what the point of this day and bringing you all here is to listen to these great speakers, then think about, now what are some sort of tangible things? What are some sort of on the ground activities that these task groups and that this interest group can do and can work on? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on something that you feel like you heard and thought, well, we need to really move forward on that, or we need somebody to kind of focus on on that? Just sort of open it up and see if there's any initial thoughts.
Hi. It's not really something concrete maybe, but in a lot of these discussions that I've been having and the research for European projects that I've been doing, it is really an issue still, I think, that a lot of people just don't want to touch. So I think first step, awareness, and creating a community where people can actually talk about these things and do actually talk about these things is, yeah, that's already an important gain, I think.
One thing I heard for the first time today, I think, was the discussion of metadata about privacy. To have a data set where you knew what it is you could do with it. But the other thing I heard in the talk from UCLA was the idea of having triggers. So if you could put into your metadata what was the trigger that would have to make you re-look at it. Because one of the things we've been hearing is everything is changing, but you could somehow park some data and to have those triggers embedded to say, this has the personal subject stuff you worried about, this has the institutional stuff you worried about. So you actually have quite a rich ontology, not just about this is open, this is safeguarded, this is closed-ish, this is really, really restricted, but actually what might make you change that decision. I thought that was two new things I heard today I hadn't heard before.
Ruth's next, I think.
Okay.
I was just going to say that some of the things that you talked about, I'm not sure whether they count as the beginnings of a framework or the beginnings of policy recommendations and guidance, but they certainly are things that probably should be captured and described a little bit what the issues around them are. You know, the issue of, is it personal privacy? Is there a community that needs to be concerned? You know, those are things that I don't think a lot of people really understand, and just having a place to record that kind of information, you know, is a start at some subset of those.
Yeah, just really briefly a comment on what you mentioned. I also really thought it was very interesting how John Wilbanks talked about the app and the research toolkit, and instead of having this this lock, to have like a red hand, so to say, okay, hey, watch out, you need to look at this, instead of yeah, I thought that was quite interesting.
So I had two minor comments. First of all, having seen this list for the first time, following on from what was just said, basically it seems to me that this covers a range of really important stuff that altogether, and I just wonder whether some of the things, by having so many different levels which are really interlinking, whether trying to break them up into separate elements might be sort of counterproductive in terms of moving forward, and whether they could maybe be grouped a bit. I was just...
Yeah, we did sort of talk about how, you know, some of these may be subsumed under others, or some of them, for instance, framework and metadata, there may be a little bit of time where there's a group that's discussing framework, and then, you know, certain you know, after they've made a little progress, and the metadata group sort of comes in, right, rather than having each of these groups working sort of separately and coming together solely, right. So thinking more carefully about what is the scope that all of these groups fall within, and what sort of the order of when one would need to start versus when one, you know, versus the ones that could just sort of happen simultaneously.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, yeah. Another question for Neil, following on from what you're saying. So are you basically suggesting an extension of the metadata one there, or are you, so that's basically within that framework? Okay, yeah.
To have the triggers of what makes you rethink them.
Yeah, because that seems a really valuable suggestion to me.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that, so we've talked about how some of these definitions are fraught, and I think something that, you know, does a definition of why they're fraught, and then maybe picks off some little subset, you know, like on what is research, for example. You might pick off a little easy subset to do. like maybe it's a researcher in academia, and you work on some of those issues for a while, and then you broaden the scope a little. Might be a way of at least moving forward, you know, in a fashion that gets you somewhere, because if you don't nibble off a little bits around the edges, it may be hard to make a heck of a lot of progress. But if you try and come up with some little smaller bits on any of those topics, it might be helpful.
Yeah, one of the things that we did, actually, it was part of a project that we're about ready to publish on alternative metrics, which was to look at different persona that use these new alt metrics, librarian or administrator or grant funder or researcher, and then look at their motivation, what their use cases were. So we kind of created a metric, a matrix of, you know, because researchers, when you're talking about assessment, they can use assessment for, you know, trying to find new research partners, or trying to find discovery of new research angles, and using metrics to kind of identify new topics or discover new areas of inquiry. Or they could use it to promote their work, or promotion and tenure decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so looking at a combination of use cases and persona was something that we did. It seemed very successful in that context, and I think would also might make sense in this as well, where you look at, I mean, because a researcher might be dealing with privacy from the perspective of, well, I'm the researcher gathering the data, or they might be coming at it from the perspective of, I want to reuse someone else's data, and I want metadata related to it. I want to understand what I can do. So there's a kind of variation of use case and audience that in something this complicated might be valuable.
Yeah, I think to add to audience, I think it's important to be sort of narrowing audience, because we talked about a lot of audiences today. We've talked about sort of the researcher. We talked about the repository manager. We talked about the university and sort of governance. So there's sort of a lot of audiences. So I think part of this too is sort of scoping down who sort of going to be the focus in these areas.
I had a couple of things, and I'll hopefully do these in a sensible order. One is, you asked what tangible things do we want this group to produce at the end of this. One thing that I would really love to see is, let's say like we ironed out all of the problems, like it's solid, and I'm seeing some smiles because it's not going to happen, but let's say we did that. We would still need some kind of plan to address the social or cultural sides of this. Anytime we're doing any sort of adoption of something new, we're dealing with people, and people are super messy, and organizations are made of people, and so organizations are super messy, and so some kind of training, like this is how we talk about these things with people when there are agendas on the line, and when there's tenure, and when there's, you know, stuff, and it's hard. So a training plan of some kind would be awesome. I would love to avoid technological solutions if we can. I think that I fear obsolescence of those technological solutions pretty quickly. So I think it could end up making it short-sighted in some sense. So if we do offer technological solutions, I'd like those to be very simple if possible. And maybe that's not, you know, the right way. It's just my gut feeling right now. One thing I love to see is ideas of responsibility So the idea of a chief privacy officer was very new to me, and that might not be the case for other people, but so that doesn't mean we have to invent new job titles, but giving either a person or a body some kind of central responsibility that initiates these conversations. I know that there's lots of institutions, including my own, that has a chief diversity officer that it's not only their job title, but they are sort of the point person to talk about diversity issues. And so we had a point person to talk about privacy issues in some organizational context. I think that'd be cool. And then the last one is really hard for me to articulate, so bear with me. One is, I get that we're dealing with really ambiguous ideas and that they're dynamic and culturally constructed. There's a certain intersectional nature to them. And so part of me wants to hammer out, like, let's just focus all our time on defining what research is. And like someone said, that we could be here for a very long time doing that. But for me, it's motivated by fear, because I don't want to discriminate. I want, research to be super inclusive. I want, data to be inclusive, so I don't leave people out. And so there's the tension between wanting to define things really clearly so we don't discriminate against people, and then actually getting things done. And so I want to acknowledge that tension and give people the benefit of the doubt that even if we're moving quickly, that it's not because people want to exclude people from this process. And so I guess I'm asking for a spirit of generosity upon everybody's part, that if we move quickly, it's because we want to produce something awesome, rather than we want to make sure someone's not at the table. So I guess it's more of a request than a comment or a question, but thank you.
Okay. I also just wanted to add a few things. Something that immediately came up when we were talking a bit about focus is every time I start research, I get the question, okay, but what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And I don't see the question there yet. So I'm still really interested in, okay, what are we trying to solve here? Because maybe that will help getting a focus. A few points, because I've been doing some research in this field also. I think it's important to look at, when we are going to define what we define as being research, to also make the distinction between commercial and non-commercial research. Maybe I should explain that I have a legal background, so I know that this is a very important distinction to make from a legal perspective. So maybe we should make a statement or something about that, or at least it can be an issue to discuss. Again, also, I mean, privacy, the moment you start to talk about it with people, everybody has their idea of what is privacy, what is personal data. I mean, it's not really crystallized, and especially in relationship to research. I mean, what are we talking about? I really think that we should try and come up with some working definitions, because of course we can discuss about this from all of our backgrounds, and we all have very different backgrounds, so we have all very different definitions and very different ideas. To come to working definitions, I think that would probably help. The same with data, research data. What is data? Metadata. Can metadata ever have privacy? How do I say that? Privacy information in it. Is it then still metadata, or does it become something else? I think that these are also issues that we should maybe look at. And yeah, with the tech solutions, yeah, it would be, of course, important or relevant to think of technological neutral solutions if we are going that way. So yeah, just a few things in the group.
All right, so I'd like to jump back for a second to the question of audience, and I just wanted to say that I think it would be great if we could engage the IRB / whatever that might be across the world for other nations in these conversations, and perhaps even a formal way. I don't know if that's already going on, but I know I at least know of an example of it seeming like text mining, questions about the ethics of text mining seems to be kind of a hot potato in my world. Everyone's kind of passing that around and not really dealing with it. And so, it's one of those places that I'm like, maybe the IRB could deal with it, and maybe they're not. And so I think engaging them in these conversations could be really valuable. Thank you.
Just building on the idea of inclusiveness, to Shay's point, we have I'm just learning about it as well, a chief privacy officer, but we also have the idea of chief data officers and chief information officers. So I think it would be helpful perhaps if the interest group built on one of the tasks outlined, which is the disciplinary differences, and actually engage those groups and those entities in this conversation of privacy implications so that we all understand what we're talking about in our domains.
Good, quick follow-up to your 2 points about communities to engage. CIOs, that's a fairly well-established community group, and say EDUCAUSE might be one way to reach out to that community. And so CIOs, yes, maybe, but I'm wondering, chief privacy officers or IRBs, the same applies. Are there ways in which there's some entity that we can reach out to engage? I mean, IRBs are usually, communities of faculty. Are they organized in any way? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's like a national IRB sort of, yeah. And also, I've just learned about Primer, I think is how you say it out loud. It's a organization and conference, because I've been sort of creeping on where do the IRB people go for conferences and things like that. And so that's one of them. And yeah, so they're all managed, it looks like, in some sort of central capacity that perhaps someone else could speak to.
I think the other group that sort of comes into this is there is the Research Managers Association, like the people who manage research grants in universities. They're not the people who do the research, but there seems to be a good overlap between those two communities as well. But I think, yes, it is a faculty review process, but it's really, like many things in the university that faculty do, heavily administrated. So, of late, none of my IRBs, by the way, all of which have included personally identifiable data, with only a promise of confidentiality, have made it they haven't been sent on to the faculty group. They've been reviewed by the staff of the IRB because they fit certain parameters that those parameters say, yeah, things that fit those parameters, we don't bother the full faculty group with because we already have protocols for dealing with them and we deal with them administratively. So I think there's a huge amount of research, if it's IRB related, that in the social sciences and humanities areas especially, that is dealt with much more as an administrative process of, oh, you fit in this category, therefore we know you're fine, and we don't look at it any further. So I think there's like a big iceberg under that's handled by administration as opposed to the faculty groups.
Do you want to? Well,
So you'll be.
no, here.
Yeah, so for those of you at a university, of which I'm not one, I have to say that you just defined a community that may have, its own issues, but it might not even be the majority of researchers anymore. We heard this morning that most of the real data that's coming out is not even captured anywhere close to academia. Though I have to say I'm kind of close to academia because it is a research organization. It's just not a university. And I think it's fine to say that, chewing off, here's things universities could do, is fine, but if that misses a lot of the data, that really isn't, it's a good start, but you have to recognize that there's a bigger world that actually is where most of the danger is. So I'm not sure, you want to do about that.
I just want to
Can-
one more thing about the IRB.
Well, I guess, and I'll be brief. I think we need to establish some constraints somewhere. And while there is a lot of research that is done by a variety of organizations like pharma, or business, et cetera, government, that don't fall into necessarily the rubric of research data as we're talking about it here. And I think we should be reticent to say we can set up forward principles but we should be cognizant that, say, media organizations are not likely to follow, or pharma companies may or may not follow. So while we can acknowledge that we're only talking about privacy and research data in one particular community, we also need to recognize that we don't have and are unlikely to have pharma company representatives participating in this project. So if you guys disagree, that's fine. I want to, like, for example, it's unlikely that we're going to get Facebook in the room and they're going to listen to us at all.
Actually, I'm not even sure I believe that, because I've actually had Facebook in the room with meetings with me. So with ESIP community, Microsoft Research, Google, and Facebook show up all the time. Now, and yes, we do talk about ethical issues, but it's not just those people either. I mean, if you think about it, all the, professional societies, AGU, for example, is dealing with these exact ethical issues right at the moment. They just came out with a brand new privacy policy. I was on their task force that created that. The question in my mind is, great, it's wonderful. Are they actually going to follow through and really implement it? And we'll see. And that community, it's 60,000 strong. And yes, half of them work for the oil industry. So you can think about what the ethical issues are there. I mean, you just have to mention the word Exxon, for example. So I think limiting it to simply tenure track people at a university is really limiting it in terms of even where papers are coming from these days.
I just want to co-sign that point. I think the implications are the implications. Data is data. Even if we don't want to sit down and write it down what the definition is, the implications are across the board. So as to the extent that we can engage other groups outside of academia and and make apparent the commonalities, perhaps we'll get closer to a solution or something acceptable of a solution quicker.
So I know we're getting close to running out of time, so I just want to make sure, I don't know if someone had the mic and was about to talk, but, there's a few people lined up?
Yeah.
Okay, and then, oh yeah, no, that's fine. And then I guess just as they're speaking, just think, is there anything missing? Is there anything we didn't talk about today that sort of falls within the realm of these conversations? So we'll let these folks speak first.
Yeah, sorry, still on the topic of focus, I guess. Maybe I missed it, but have you guys already defined what the focus is going to be in terms of research? Because, linking again on our own research I'm from Europe, by the way, so some of the things that you are discussing, I have no idea what you're talking about. Sorry. In the field of copyright, we are still discussing what is research, what is the relationship of research and copyright, for example. And I think that this discussion is also really relevant here. So when can you use certain data for certain research, and then research not being defined by research is only being done in academia. No, research is basically done everywhere. I mean, citizen scientists, would you call that research as well? Even if they are not affiliated with a university. And for example, for copyright protection, that would also fall under the scope of the regulations, and for privacy, that would be the same. So I don't know if somebody from the co-chairs can say something about the scope of research before we go into a long discussion.
That's not, actually, this is a great conversation. It is not a conversation that we, either the co-chairs or the group is actually tackled yet. So
Okay, cool.
it's
So it's
completely open.
Awesome.
I'm just concerned about mission creep, that's all. Well, that's, I think, if we creep into, you know, if we keep working and working, that's fine. I just,
We didn't think about what we do first,
first, second priorities. Yeah, I don't want.
brainstorming, not, I guess
Yeah, right. My voice is no more important than anyone else's.
Well, off of that topic, I was just thinking, as we were talking about the international implications and as well as the problems with informed consent and the fact that people sign away their children, it would be phenomenal, or if possible, if there were symbols that became recognized. Like, in addition to the hand, it's like hand throwing away your data. And everybody recognizes the fact that, whoa, data's gonna go somewhere if I click on this app. And I know that it wouldn't perfectly work with a single symbol, but there are, I mean, everybody knows the thumbs up, everybody knows like. So I was just thinking, how could we use what has already been established in the toolkit that we saw today and approaching informed consent that way, using symbols that kind of become standard and used perhaps even worldwide.
Yeah, we're working on that a little bit at Data and Society, actually, because there's a lot of power in what a symbol represents, and I think John really demonstrated that by showing when we talk about privacy, we're not talking about a lock, we're not talking about, we're talking about like just stopping and so yeah, so we're kind of starting to look at that and have designers kind of working on images. So I think that's a great area to kind of focus on.
Yeah, God, I'm really sorry for talking so much. This is just a topic I'm so excited about. So, I've been having discussions with a few people on exactly this. Can we come up with, like Creative Commons has come up with these symbols of different layers of protection, if we can do something similar for data protection. So my data is available for this and this and this. My data is never available for this and this and this. So that was is maybe something to think about as well. And one small thing again on focus. I would really like to see, if it's possible, looking at the kind of community that RDA is to have a strong focus on international data sharing. I think that we can really establish something there, because I mean, in the US and in Europe, there are lots of groups already working on these issues, which is fantastic, which we can definitely hook on about. But I think an additional bonus that we can provide is really the international data sharing.
I was going to lob in one more random thought to follow that lovely random thought over there, which was, can we try and find a word to not use the word sharing? It sounds like you're standing on the naughty step if you don't. And in the whole point of informed consent, you should be allowed to say no. And so we need to find another word to describe the movement of data which has been consented, which doesn't preclude people who don't want to consent, because lots of people do not want to have their data moved around. So if the community could come up with new words which don't sound pejorative, that would be helpful.
So one of the things that we heard a couple of times today was on the subject of identifying what the risks and concerns are. And that, I think, is a potential other mechanism for organizing the results of this for different kinds of risks to different kinds of groups. This goes back to you and your profiles thing, which I think is another way. I'm sorry, an interest group probably is going to be here for 20 years, but that doesn't mean you can't chip off little itty bitty bits and do them. So.
Okay, I don't want
My point was simply, I just didn't want to be here leading the group for 20 years, that's all.
Okay, this will be our last comment. and we'll wrap up.
I'd like to follow up on what Freya said, because I said before, I'm a bit skeptical concerning this idea of the standardized labels. What I could imagine, and actually that fits future TDM, is to collect consent forms and then via a text and data mining effort try to find similarities between the consent forms and then just suggest standard formulations, standard phrases. So you put into the consent form whatever you like, but you have a small machine that suggests to you standard phrases. And that would be kind of something that could go on for some time, and you see how much of the standard phrases get used, and that could be a way to find a path for some kind of similarities. I could imagine that is also something that is fairly practical.
That reminds me of the work that was initially done with subscription licenses, in that, when subscriptions first came out and they were licensing electronic content, everyone had their own, and that existed for the first decade or so. And now there's been a consolidation around a handful of terminologies that get included in a number of model licenses. Again, just a similarity, an analogy.
Okay, we'll let Paul say the last thing.
Okay, so that particular process you're talking about, Christoph, so Bartha Noppers from McGill has done that process with a large number of biobanking consent forms. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. It shouldn't be done with a broader remit, but there's input that I'm sure could come from that. She leads one of the working groups on the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health in relation to things including data sharing. So that fit in well with that.
What was her name again? Bartha Noppers.
Oh, sorry, Bartha Noppers.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to thank you all for joining us today and participating with us today. If you are around, if you're here, our interest group is meeting Thursday at 2. So join us there, or you can follow our group if you're not already a part of it. We'd love to kind of continue to talk about these ideas and actually focus in on a few things and get working. So thank you.
Great. And I would also like to thank you, and thank you, Bonnie, for helping to lead this conversation. I would like to thank all of you for being here on a Sunday, for contributing your thoughts and ideas to this process. As I said, this is sort of a brainstorming discussion forum. I think there were a lot of ideas surfaced, and there were a lot of things that the group can kind of address and tackle and push forward with in terms of what is research and what communities are we trying to serve and focus. These are great conversations and a great way to get us kicked off. So thank you all for that. Again, if you can join us on Thursday, that would be fantastic. If not, if any of you are not members of the working group, and anyone not listening to the recording, if you are not members of the working group, interest group, you can simply join by going to the interest group page and signing up for Research Data Alliance, and just joining the group is a great way to get started. There's a mailing list which hopefully will be more active moving out in the next couple months. So a lot of the work that will be, I would say, probably 90% of the work that we'll be doing will be virtual. so, you know, teleconferences and virtual meetings, et cetera. So there shouldn't be a high bar to participation, just time, effort, and energy. So please volunteer, contribute. And again, if you have any ideas, any thoughts after this event, please do post them to the group or email any of us. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. So with that, I want to thank and kind of formally draw this symposium to a close. Again, I think it's important that we thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for support of this project and their interest in supporting research data and research data sharing. So many thanks to them. And with that, thanks to all of our virtual participants and the people who are listening to the recording. And thank you all. Have a good evening. We can draw things to a close. If anyone is interested, we didn't plan a formal reception, but if anyone is interested, and if you're here, was just thinking of gathering in the yard house upstairs. They supposedly have the largest selection of beer in the world. I'm dubious, but if anyone wants to join us, we can we'll adjourn to the pub, so to speak, for a little while to have a celebratory drink and moving forward. So if anyone is interested, probably in 15 or 20 minutes, I guess. Just look for us. We don't have a table, and we haven't even let them know that there will be 20 people descending on them. So, so with that, thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.